Picture this: thousands of years ago, when Europe was still wild and untamed, a mysterious civilization was quietly building power in the frozen north. Deep within the mist-covered forests of ancient Scandinavia, where bitter winds howled across desolate coastlines, an extraordinary people were preparing to change the course of history forever. These weren't just any ordinary tribe wandering through the wilderness. The Goths were emerging as one of the most fascinating and influential cultures the ancient world had ever seen. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about their story. We can actually trace their footsteps through time, thanks to incredible archaeological discoveries that read like chapters from an adventure novel. When modern researchers started digging into the rich soil of southern Sweden and the scattered Baltic islands, they uncovered something that completely revolutionized our understanding of Gothic origins. What they found wasn't just random artifacts buried in the ground. Instead, they discovered a sophisticated network of evidence that painted a crystal-clear picture of cultural evolution spanning centuries. The island of Gotland became the crown jewel of these discoveries. Imagine the largest island in the entire Baltic Sea, hiding beneath its surface thousands upon thousands of ancient graves, each one telling a piece of the Gothic story. These weren't simple burial sites either. The craftsmanship and attention to detail found in these excavations revealed a civilization far more advanced than anyone had previously imagined. What makes these findings absolutely extraordinary is how they connect the dots across vast distances and time periods. Those distinctive boat-shaped brooches, intricate belt buckles, and uniquely styled pottery vessels discovered in Swedish burial grounds from the 1st and 2nd centuries. They're virtually identical to artifacts later found scattered across Eastern Europe, creating an unmistakable trail of cultural breadcrumbs that researchers could follow. But the real game-changer was discovering the wheelbark culture flourishing in Poland's Vistula River Valley. This archaeological treasure trove provided the missing link that scholars had been searching for. The connection between northern Scandinavia and these Polish settlements wasn't just coincidental. It was deliberate, systematic, and beautifully preserved in the archaeological record. The maritime influence runs deep in Gothic culture, and nowhere is this more evident than in their unique burial practices. Those stone ship settings, where graves were carefully outlined with stones arranged to mimic the shape of vessels, weren't just decorative choices. They represented a fundamental connection to the sea that would eventually enable the Goths' incredible expansion across the Baltic region and beyond. Here's where the Gothic story takes an absolutely fascinating turn that reveals the true power behind their incredible success. You see, Gothic kings didn't just rule because they were the strongest warriors or the wealthiest landowners. Their authority came from something far more profound and mystical that connected them directly to the divine realm itself. These rulers claimed direct bloodlines tracing back to the god Goth, a powerful deity whose very name might be the source of the word Gothic itself. Think about that for a moment. An entire civilization named after their divine ancestor, carrying that sacred connection in their very identity. This wasn't just political propaganda either. Military victories served as concrete proof that the gods favored their chosen leaders, creating a cycle where success reinforced divine legitimacy and divine backing enabled greater triumphs. The religious world of the early Goths was rich, complex, and deeply intertwined with their daily existence. War gods received elaborate offerings and ceremonies, while fertility goddesses ensured abundant harvests and healthy children. But what's truly remarkable is how archaeologists have uncovered these ancient spiritual practices through incredibly preserved burial sites that read like snapshots frozen in time. Picture this: elaborate ritual deposits containing weapons, jewelry, and carefully prepared food offerings, all intended to equip the deceased for their journey into the afterlife. These weren't simple burials, they were sophisticated spiritual transactions that required extensive community resources and planning. Even more intriguing, the practice of weapon sacrifice in sacred bogs and lakes, a tradition deeply rooted in Scandinavian culture, continued among Gothic communities even after they had migrated hundreds of miles south into Poland. This cultural continuity, despite massive geographical displacement, tells us something profound about Gothic identity. They weren't just wandering tribes adapting to whatever circumstances they encountered. Instead, they were deliberately preserving and transmitting their most sacred traditions across generations and vast distances. The artistic revolution that emerged during their time in the Vistula region represents one of the most spectacular cultural developments in ancient European history. Gothic metalworkers didn't just maintain their traditional crafting skills, they elevated them to entirely new levels of sophistication and beauty that would influence European decorative arts for centuries to come. Those eagle-headed fibulae became far more than simple clothing fasteners. These intricate silver brooches, decorated with geometric patterns that required incredible skill to create, evolved into powerful symbols of Gothic identity that could be recognized instantly across the entire continent. The progression of these designs, traceable through archaeological finds, shows increasing complexity and regional variations that reflect the dynamic, evolving nature of Gothic culture as communities expanded and encountered new influences. Pottery production tells an equally compelling story of cultural adaptation and innovation. The handmade vessels discovered in Wilbark sites weren't just functional containers, they were artistic expressions that served both practical daily needs and sacred ceremonial purposes. Large storage jars indicate communities prosperous enough to maintain significant agricultural surpluses, while smaller decorated vessels suggest sophisticated ritual practices that connected the living with their spiritual beliefs. The Gothic exodus from Poland during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries represents one of history's most dramatic and systematic population movements. Archaeological evidence paints a vivid picture of entire communities methodically dismantling their longhouses and carefully burying precious objects in hidden hoards that wouldn't be discovered for over a millennium. This wasn't chaotic flight, it was organized, deliberate migration following ancient trade routes and river valleys toward a specific destination that offered incredible opportunities. That destination was the vast Pontic-Caspian steppe region, stretching from the Dniester River to the Don River across modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia. This wasn't random wandering either. Gothic leaders had identified territory that offered everything their expanding population needed: abundant pasture land for livestock, fertile soil perfect for agriculture, and strategic positioning along lucrative trade routes connecting the Baltic with Black Sea and Mediterranean markets. But the Gothic story becomes even more incredible when we discover they weren't operating in isolation. Picture this vast network of interconnected Germanic tribes, each carving out their own territories and developing unique specializations that would make them legendary across Europe. The Gepids, sharing deep linguistic and cultural bonds with their Gothic cousins, established thriving settlements throughout the Carpathian Basin, creating a complex web of alliances and rivalries that kept the entire region in constant diplomatic flux. Meanwhile, along the northern Black Sea coastline, the Heruli were making names for themselves as some of the most fearsome seafarers and raiders the ancient world had ever encountered. These weren't just random pirate bands either. They were organized, skilled maritime warriors whose reputation struck fear into coastal settlements from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Together with various other Germanic populations, these groups formed an intricate network of related but fiercely independent political entities that would spend centuries cooperating, competing, and occasionally going to war with each other. Managing this incredible diversity required extraordinary leadership, and that's exactly what emerged during this pivotal period. Archaeological discoveries from elite burial sites reveal individuals whose wealth and status were absolutely mind-blowing by ancient standards. These weren't just successful warriors, they were sophisticated political operators who understood how to navigate complex international relationships while accumulating vast fortunes through trade and diplomacy. Take the spectacular burial discovered at Consecti in Romania, where archaeologists uncovered a warrior whose grave goods read like an inventory of ancient luxury items. This individual was interred with a magnificent gold-hilted sword, intricate silver belt fittings, and Roman coins that tell us he wasn't just a military leader, he was a player in international politics with connections reaching directly into the heart of the Roman Empire itself. The political evolution happening across Gothic territories during this period represents one of the most fascinating transformations in ancient European history. Traditional Germanic assembly systems, which had worked perfectly for mobile tribal groups, suddenly needed to accommodate the realities of governing settled agricultural communities alongside nomadic pastoral groups. The solution they developed was nothing short of revolutionary. Gothic rulers began adapting their governance structures to include representatives from various tribal groups, creating a more complex but incredibly flexible form of political organization. Kings and chieftains could no longer rely solely on military prowess for their authority. They needed to demonstrate mastery of agricultural production, skillful management of trade relationships, and sophisticated diplomatic negotiations with neighboring powers who could either become valuable allies or dangerous enemies. This shift toward territorial kingdoms marked a complete departure from earlier Germanic political traditions. Instead of simply leading mobile tribal groups that followed seasonal migration patterns, Gothic rulers began claiming authority over specific geographical regions with defined boundaries that needed constant defense and administration. This territorialization demanded entirely new governmental structures, including appointed local governors, systematic tribute collection systems, and permanent military garrisons positioned strategically to defend borders and maintain internal order. The religious landscape within Gothic territories became equally complex and fascinating. While traditional Germanic paganism remained dominant, it began incorporating elements from Sarmatian and Scythian religious traditions in ways that created entirely new spiritual practices. Archaeological evidence reveals ritual deposits that combine Germanic weapon sacrifices with Sarmatian horse burials and Scythian animal-style decorative elements. This wasn't cultural confusion, it was deliberate syncretism that demonstrated Gothic flexibility in integrating diverse populations while maintaining their distinctive identity. The economic foundation supporting this entire civilization was absolutely remarkable in its sophistication and scale. The fertile black earth soils of Ukraine provided ideal conditions for large-scale grain cultivation, while extensive grasslands supported enormous herds of cattle and horses that represented both wealth and military resources. Gothic communities developed incredibly sophisticated systems for managing these resources, including seasonal migration patterns for livestock and crop rotation techniques that maintained soil fertility across vast territories. But here's what makes their story truly extraordinary: trade relationships that connected Gothic territories with markets throughout Europe and beyond. Amber from the distant Baltic continued flowing southward through Gothic intermediaries, while Roman luxury goods moved northward in exchange for furs, slaves, and agricultural products. Some coin hoards discovered in Gothic settlements contained thousands of Roman denarii spanning several centuries of minting, proving these weren't occasional trading relationships but sustained commercial networks that generated enormous wealth. The strategic positioning of Gothic territories along the Dnieper River provided access to what would become the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks, a trade corridor that would later prove crucial for medieval commerce between Scandinavia and Byzantium. Gothic control of key river crossings and portage points enabled them to extract tribute from merchant caravans while participating directly in long-distance commerce, creating an economic advantage that contributed significantly to the wealth and power of Gothic rulers. Now here's where the Gothic story takes an absolutely fascinating twist that reveals just how adaptable and innovative these ancient peoples truly were. While the Tervingi were building their agricultural empire west of the Dniester, something completely different was happening in the vast open steppes stretching eastward toward the Don River. The Greuthungi Confederation was creating an entirely different model of civilization, one that would prove just as powerful but operated on completely different principles. Picture this: endless grasslands where the horizon stretches beyond imagination, where natural defensive barriers simply don't exist, and where survival depends on mobility, speed, and the ability to strike like lightning before disappearing into the vastness. This environment demanded revolutionary approaches to everything from military organization to daily life, and the Greuthungi rose to meet these challenges with absolutely brilliant innovations. Their political structure was a masterpiece of decentralized coordination that allowed multiple chieftains to control different tribal segments, while maintaining unified action through councils and assemblies. This wasn't chaos or disorganization, it was sophisticated management of complexity that enabled them to coordinate movements across territories so vast they boggle the modern mind. Think about the logistics required to manage dispersed communities across hundreds of thousands of square miles, while maintaining cultural unity and military effectiveness. The legendary King Ermanaric perfectly exemplified this type of leadership. This wasn't a ruler sitting in a palace issuing commands to distant subjects. Instead, he commanded loyalty through proven military success and diplomatic brilliance, building a confederation that would eventually stretch from the Baltic Sea all the way to the Black Sea. His authority came not from controlling fixed territories, but from his ability to inspire and coordinate the actions of independent-minded tribal groups who chose to follow his leadership. The economic foundations supporting these two Gothic confederations created completely different patterns of trade and resource utilization that tell us incredible things about ancient European commerce. The Tervingi, with their agricultural surpluses and strategic positioning along Danubian trade routes, developed extensive commercial relationships with Roman merchants and provincial administrators that generated enormous wealth and cultural exchange. Their territories became production centers for grain, livestock, and craft goods that found eager markets throughout Roman cities, while Roman luxury items, wine, and manufactured goods flowed northward in return. But here's what's truly remarkable. Tervingi craftsmen achieved levels of sophistication in metalwork that rivaled the finest artisans anywhere in the ancient world. The workshops at sites like Pietro Asiella produced elaborate fibulae featuring intricate animal interlace patterns, precious garnet inlays, and sophisticated granulation techniques that were absolutely breathtaking in their complexity and beauty. These luxury items weren't just decorative pieces either. They served dual functions as practical clothing fasteners and powerful symbols of wealth, status, and cultural identity. Every piece told a story about its owner, while reinforcing distinctive Gothic artistic traditions that could be recognized instantly across the entire continent. Meanwhile, the Greuthungi economy centered on something completely different but equally impressive: large-scale pastoralism combined with long-distance trade operations that connected markets from the Black Sea to Central Asia. Their enormous herds of cattle, sheep, and horses provided foundations for both subsistence and commercial activities that generated wealth through entirely different mechanisms than their Western cousins. Greuthungi merchants operated along trade routes that crossed vast distances, dealing in furs, amber, slaves, and livestock. Their mobility gave them incredible advantages in accessing seasonal markets and avoiding the taxes and restrictions that hampered settled merchants. But perhaps most remarkably, they developed horse breeding into a fine art, creating strains of cavalry mounts that were prized throughout Europe for their speed, endurance, and fighting ability. Archaeological evidence from Greuthungi burial sites reveals elaborate horse harnesses, bits, and saddle fittings that demonstrate just how central mounted warfare was to their entire cultural identity. The integration of Sarmatian heavy cavalry techniques with traditional Germanic warrior practices produced a distinctive fighting style that would influence European warfare for centuries to come. The religious and cultural differences between these two confederations reflected their distinct political and economic developments in absolutely fascinating ways. The Tervingi, with their settled lifestyle and closer Roman contacts, began incorporating Mediterranean influences into traditional Germanic religious practices, creating syncretic traditions that combined the best of both worlds. Meanwhile, the Greuthungi maintained more traditional Germanic practices adapted to their mobile lifestyle, emphasizing portable sacred objects and seasonal ceremonies that could be performed anywhere. But then everything changed with the arrival of the Hunnic peoples during the mid-4th century, creating unprecedented challenges that would test both Gothic confederations in ways they had never imagined possible. And then came the moment that would change everything forever. Picture this: from the vast expanses of Central Asia, a force unlike anything Europe had ever encountered was about to unleash chaos on an unprecedented scale. The Huns weren't just another nomadic tribe looking for better grazing lands. They were a military revolution on horseback, armed with technologies and tactical systems that would make even the mighty Goths look like they were fighting with Stone Age weapons. What made the Hunnic war machine so absolutely devastating wasn't just their legendary ferocity, it was their incredible technological sophistication. These warriors wielded composite bows that were engineering marvels, constructed from carefully layered horn, wood, and sinew that achieved ranges and penetrating power that completely outclassed anything Gothic warriors had ever faced. But here's what makes their story truly terrifying. They had learned advanced siege techniques from Chinese and Persian civilizations, creating a military system that combined traditional steppe mobility with cutting-edge warfare technology. The Hunnic communication systems were nothing short of revolutionary. They could coordinate multiple cavalry armies across distances that would challenge modern military commanders, concentrating overwhelming force at decisive points with precision that left their enemies completely bewildered. When you're facing an enemy that can appear anywhere, anytime, with crushing superiority in numbers and weapons, traditional defensive strategies become absolutely useless. The Greuthungi Confederation, with their eastern territories stretching toward Asia, became the first to experience this nightmare firsthand. Those same vast open steppes that had provided them with mobility advantages and access to lucrative trade routes suddenly became highways for Hunnic destruction. The speed and coordination of these attacks completely overwhelmed every defensive strategy the Goths had developed over generations of steppe warfare. Picture the absolute chaos as entire Greuthungi populations abandoned territories their ancestors had controlled for centuries, fleeing westward in desperate searches for defensible positions. This wasn't just military defeat, it was civilizational collapse happening in real time. The collapse of Greuthungi resistance under Hunnic pressure triggered a refugee crisis that affected the entire Gothic world in ways that are difficult to imagine. Displaced populations flooded westward into Tervingi territories, creating demographic pressures that no ancient society was equipped to handle. Established communities suddenly found themselves struggling to accommodate desperate newcomers while maintaining their own security against an enemy that could strike anywhere without warning. Resources that had supported stable populations for generations were stretched beyond breaking points, creating political tensions that threatened to tear Gothic society apart from within. The Tervingi Confederation faced impossible choices as Hunnic forces continued their relentless westward advance. Their more centralized political structure allowed for coordinated resistance efforts that gave them temporary advantages, but their settled populations and fixed fortifications became liabilities when facing an enemy that specialized in mobility and surprise attacks. The decision to seek Roman protection by crossing the Danube represented a fundamental transformation in Gothic strategy, abandoning territories they had fought to control for generations in favor of simple survival. The Hunnic invasions accelerated the permanent division between the two Gothic confederations by forcing them to pursue completely different survival strategies. The Tervundi, maintaining greater political cohesion under their king Fritigern, managed to negotiate their entry into Roman territory as a unified group. Meanwhile, the Greuthungi, scattered and devastated by the initial Hunnic attacks, fragmented into smaller groups that would follow different paths through the chaos that was about to engulf all of Europe. The religious implications of these invasions affected both confederations in profound ways that would echo through centuries. The Tervingi, already exposed to Christian influences through their Roman contacts, began viewing Christianity as potential divine protection against pagan enemies. The conversion of significant Tervingi populations to Arian Christianity during this period reflected both practical political calculations and genuine religious conviction born from desperation. The scattered Greuthungi maintained traditional religious practices while adapting to circumstances that tested every aspect of their cultural identity. Some groups eventually accepted Hunnic overlordship and integrated into the expanding Hunnic Confederation, while others maintained independence through constant warfare and migration that would scatter Gothic peoples across the entire continent. But here's where the story becomes even more dramatic. While the Goths were fighting for survival against the Huns, they were simultaneously preparing for confrontations with the Roman Empire that would reshape European civilization forever. By the 230 AD, before the Hunnic catastrophe, Gothic populations had consolidated control over territories stretching from the Carpathian Mountains to the Sea of Azov, creating a power base that rivaled any force Rome had previously encountered. The first major Gothic incursion into Roman territory in 238 AD revealed both the opportunistic brilliance of Gothic leadership and the empire's growing vulnerability along its extended frontiers. When Emperor Maximinus Thrax withdrew substantial forces from the Danubian frontier for his German campaigns, Gothic intelligence networks immediately recognized this weakness and moved with lightning speed to exploit it. This wasn't random barbarian raiding, this was sophisticated military planning that demonstrated remarkable coordination between supposedly independent tribal groups, suggesting unified command structures capable of executing complex operations that would challenge modern military planners. But here's the incredible part that most people don't realize about these early Gothic Roman conflicts. Roman military engineering, which had dominated warfare for centuries, was about to meet its match in ways that would shock the ancient world. The Romans had spent generations perfecting their Danubian defensive system, creating what they believed was an impenetrable network of fixed fortifications designed to stop small-scale barbarian raids before they could penetrate the empire's interior. What they hadn't anticipated was facing an enemy capable of revolutionary tactical thinking. Gothic forces didn't just attack these strongpoints head-on like previous barbarian groups. Instead, they developed sophisticated bypass strategies that allowed them to operate freely in Roman territory while leaving confused garrison troops watching empty roads from their supposedly impregnable fortresses. The Gothic withdrawal from their first major incursion reveals something absolutely fascinating about their strategic priorities that completely contradicts popular misconceptions about barbarian warfare. This wasn't a retreat caused by Roman military pressure or superior tactics. Instead, intelligence networks brought devastating news from their homeland territories. Sarmatian tribes had recognized Gothic absence as a golden opportunity and launched coordinated attacks against Gothic settlements east of the Dniester River. Picture the agonizing decision facing Gothic war leaders: continue their successful Roman campaign or return immediately to defend families and livestock under attack hundreds of miles away. The choice they made tells us everything about Gothic values and the complex calculations that drove their military strategies. This pattern of expansion, limited by homeland security concerns, would define Gothic campaigns for decades, creating a cycle where military success abroad had to be constantly balanced against vulnerabilities at home. The decade following this first incursion witnessed an arms race that transformed both civilizations in ways that would reshape European warfare forever. Gothic communities used this period to revolutionize their military capabilities, integrating captured Roman equipment and techniques, while consolidating territorial gains across vast regions. Archaeological evidence from this era reads like an inventory of military innovation: increased iron weapon production, construction of massive fortified centers, and accumulation of Roman coins and precious metals that would finance future operations on unprecedented scales. Meanwhile, Roman preparations under Emperor Gordian III represented the empire's most comprehensive response to barbarian threats in generations. The reconstruction of Danubian fortifications, establishment of new military bases, and desperate attempts to create diplomatic alliances with Gothic rivals consumed enormous resources while revealing just how seriously Rome now took the Gothic challenge. Roman intelligence operations during this period uncovered information that must have been absolutely terrifying to imperial administrators. Gothic territorial control extended far beyond anything previously imagined, while their political organization displayed sophistication that rivaled Roman provincial governance. These weren't disorganized tribal raids anymore. This was systematic expansion by a civilization capable of long-term strategic planning. When major Gothic warfare resumed in 248 AD, the timing couldn't have been more symbolically devastating for Roman prestige. Rome was celebrating its millennium, 1,000 years of imperial dominance. When news arrived that Gothic forces had assembled the largest barbarian army the empire had faced since the legendary Cimbrian and Teutonic invasions 3 centuries earlier, over 20,000 warriors had gathered under Gothic banners, representing a military confederation that included Sarmatian cavalry units, Dacian remnants, and various Germanic tribes unified under Gothic leadership. The Gothic strategy for this renewed campaign demonstrated understanding of Roman capabilities that was nothing short of brilliant. Rather than attempting to hold Roman territory permanently, which would have required enormous resources and extended supply lines, they planned coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm Roman defensive systems while extracting maximum plunder and prisoners. Their forces divided into multiple columns that could operate independently while maintaining communication and mutual support, a tactical innovation that would influence barbarian warfare throughout the migration period. The siege of Philippopolis in 249 AD marked a revolutionary moment in ancient warfare that changed everything we thought we knew about barbarian military capabilities. This wasn't just another raid on a frontier settlement. Philippopolis sat in the heart of Thrace, serving as a major administrative center with formidable defenses that had been considered virtually impregnable. What the Goths accomplished there defied every assumption about barbarian engineering capabilities. They constructed elaborate earthworks surrounding the entire city, trenches, palisades, and siege towers that demonstrated their ability to conduct complex engineering operations requiring thousands of workers and sophisticated logistical coordination. The siege lines extended for several kilometers and included multiple fortified camps connected by communication trenches that functioned like a miniature city devoted entirely to warfare. But here's the most shocking part. They were using captured Roman military equipment, including artillery pieces and siege engines operated by Roman prisoners who had been pressed into Gothic service. This wasn't just adaptation, it was systematic integration of enemy technology by engineers who understood exactly how to maximize its effectiveness. The defense of Philippopolis revealed the tragic inadequacy of Roman urban fortifications when confronted by enemies who had learned from Roman military science itself. City walls designed for traditional barbarian raids crumbled under systematic siege operations that employed undermining techniques, effective siege towers and battering rams operated by people who understood Roman defensive weaknesses better than the defenders themselves. When Philippopolis finally fell after months of siege, the psychological impact resonated throughout the empire. The enormous quantities of gold, silver, precious stones, and luxury goods captured would finance Gothic military operations for years. But more importantly, the victory demonstrated Gothic capabilities to other barbarian tribes and encouraged additional groups to join their expanding confederation. Then came the Battle of Abritus in 251 AD, the moment when Gothic military innovation reached its absolute pinnacle and changed European history forever. Emperor Decius, determined to restore Roman prestige and eliminate the Gothic threat once and for all, assembled approximately 15,000 men, including elements of the Praetorian Guard, Danubian legions, and auxiliary forces drawn from across the empire. What he faced was no longer the tribal war bands that had first crossed the Danube 13 years earlier. The Gothic army at Abritus represented military evolution in real time, heavily armed infantry organized into disciplined formations that could sustain combat against Roman legionaries, coordinated with Sarmatian heavy cavalry units whose armored cataphracts could break Roman infantry formations through sheer shock impact. The battlefield itself became a masterpiece of tactical planning that demonstrated Gothic understanding of terrain advantages and Roman weaknesses. Located in marshy terrain near modern Razgrad in Bulgaria, the position channeled Roman attacks into predetermined killing zones, while providing Gothic forces with elevated defensive positions that maximized their tactical advantages. When Gothic cavalry led by Sarmatian cataphracts charged the Roman left flank struggling through marshy ground, the impact created chaos that spread through imperial ranks like wildfire. But the most shocking moment came when Emperor Decius himself fell in battle, the first reigning emperor killed by barbarian forces, representing an unprecedented disaster for Roman prestige that announced to the world that Gothic military capabilities now rivaled the legendary Roman legions themselves. The aftermath of Abritus established Gothic reputation as the most formidable barbarian opponents Rome had ever encountered, capturing imperial standards and thousands of prisoners while demonstrating that the age of unchallenged Roman military supremacy was ending forever. Now here's where the Gothic story takes an absolutely extraordinary turn that reveals one of the most brilliant cultural transformations in ancient history. Enter Ulfilas, a figure whose revolutionary approach to religious conversion would forever change not just Gothic society, but the entire trajectory of European Christianity itself. What makes his story so incredible isn't just what he accomplished, but how he accomplished it using methods that were centuries ahead of their time. Picture this scenario. You're trying to introduce an entirely foreign religious system to a proud warrior culture that has maintained its spiritual traditions for over 1,000 years. Most missionaries throughout history have made the catastrophic mistake of trying to completely replace existing beliefs with foreign concepts that seem alien and threatening to local populations. Ulfilas took a completely different approach that was nothing short of genius. Instead of attempting to impose Roman Christian practices wholesale, he demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Gothic culture that enabled him to adapt Christian teachings to Gothic contexts while maintaining essential theological content. His revolutionary strategy emphasized continuity between existing Germanic concepts of divine authority and Christian monotheism, presenting Christianity not as the destruction of traditional Gothic beliefs, but as their ultimate fulfillment and completion. But here's what makes Ulfilas truly legendary in the annals of cultural history. He didn't just translate religious concepts, he created an entirely new writing system from scratch to preserve Gothic language and culture for eternity. This monumental undertaking required not only incredible linguistic expertise, but also the vision to develop a completely original alphabet capable of representing Gothic sounds and grammatical structures that had never been written down before. The Gothic alphabet that Ulfilas created represents one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the ancient world. Picture the complexity involved in designing 27 letters, each carefully chosen to represent specific sounds in Gothic language, while maintaining visual connections to writing systems that Gothic people would recognize. This wasn't random borrowing from existing scripts. It was systematic cultural synthesis that reflected the multicultural influences within Gothic society itself. The majority of letters derive from Greek script, reflecting Ulfilas's theological education and the Greek origins of Christian texts he was translating. Several letters borrowed from Latin script provided representations for sounds that simply didn't exist in Greek, while carefully selected symbols adapted from runic traditions maintained vital connections to Germanic writing practices that Gothic people already understood and respected. The process of biblical translation into Gothic required Ulfilas to make thousands of decisions about theological terminology and cultural adaptation that would influence Gothic Christianity for generations to come. Every single word choice became a bridge between two completely different worldviews, requiring intimate knowledge of both Christian theology and Gothic cultural associations. Take the Gothic term ward, chosen to translate the incredibly complex Greek concept of logos. This wasn't just finding equivalent words, it was maintaining theological significance while connecting to Gothic concepts of authoritative speech and divine command that resonated with warrior culture. The translation of pneuma as armor drew on Germanic spiritual traditions that associated divine power with life-giving breath, creating connections between Christian theology and existing Gothic spiritual understanding. These translation choices demonstrate Ulfilas's extraordinary skill in bridging theological concepts across cultural boundaries while maintaining absolute doctrinal integrity. He was essentially creating a new form of Christianity that was authentically Christian while being genuinely Gothic, a synthesis that had never been attempted before. The surviving fragments of Ulfilas's Gothic Bible, preserved primarily in the magnificent 6th century Codex Argentius housed at Uppsala University, provide invaluable insights into both Gothic language and early Christian theology that continue influencing scholarly research today. This manuscript, written in silver and gold ink on purple parchment, reflects the incredibly high status accorded to Christian texts within Gothic society, and demonstrates sophisticated book production capabilities that rivaled anything being produced in the Roman Empire itself. The theological implications of Gothic adoption of Arian Christianity extended far beyond simple religious conversion to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between Germanic peoples and Roman civilization. The Arian emphasis on the father's supremacy and the son's subordination provided theological justification for Gothic political independence while maintaining authentic Christian identity. This theological position enabled Gothic rulers to claim divine sanction for their authority, while simultaneously rejecting Roman imperial claims to universal dominion. It was political theology at its most sophisticated, using religious doctrine to support cultural independence while maintaining connections to the broader Christian world. The development of Gothic Christian culture during the 4th century created revolutionary new forms of artistic expression that combined traditional Germanic motifs with Christian symbolism in ways that had never been seen before. Gothic metalworkers began incorporating Christian symbols into their traditional animal-style decorations, creating hybrid artistic traditions that reflected the synthesis of pagan and Christian elements within evolving Gothic society. Gothic Christian architecture evolved from practical needs of congregational worship within communities that had previously conducted religious ceremonies in natural settings or temporary structures. The construction of permanent church buildings required adaptation of Roman architectural principles to Gothic building traditions and available materials, creating distinctive architectural forms that reflected the cultural synthesis of Gothic Christianity. The literary traditions emerging from Gothic Christian culture represented a complete departure from oral traditions that had previously dominated Germanic cultural transmission. The creation of written Gothic literature, beginning with Ulfilas's biblical translation, established entirely new forms of cultural expression that would influence Germanic literary development for centuries to come. The influence of Christianity on Gothic political organization manifested in ways that fundamentally transformed traditional Germanic governmental structures. Christian emphasis on divine authority and moral law provided new sources of legitimacy for Gothic rulers, while introducing concepts of justice and governance that complemented traditional Germanic legal practices in revolutionary ways. Gothic legal codes began incorporating Christian moral principles alongside traditional Germanic concepts, creating hybrid legal systems that reflected the complete religious transformation of Gothic society. Christian concepts of mercy and forgiveness modified traditional Germanic practices of blood revenge and compensation, while Christian ideas about divine judgment influenced procedures for determining guilt and innocence. The social structures of Gothic communities underwent significant modifications as Christian teachings about human dignity and spiritual equality challenged traditional Germanic hierarchies while maintaining social stability. The Christian Church provided alternative paths to status and influence that complemented traditional military and political routes to power, creating new opportunities for social mobility that had never existed in Germanic society. The literacy and theological training that Christian clergy brought to Gothic communities created something absolutely revolutionary, an intellectual resource that proved invaluable for navigating the incredibly complex political and cultural challenges of the late imperial period. These weren't just religious figures conducting worship services, they were educated administrators, diplomatic negotiators, and cultural interpreters who could bridge the gap between Gothic traditions and the rapidly changing world around them. But here's what makes the Gothic Christian story truly fascinating. The persistence of Arian Christianity among Gothic peoples throughout the entire migration period reflected something far deeper than simple religious preference. This was theological conviction merged with political necessity in ways that would shape European history for centuries to come. The theological differences between Arian and Nicene Christianity became powerful markers of ethnic and political identity that distinguished Gothic communities from Roman populations in fundamental ways. Picture the strategic brilliance of this religious choice. Maintaining Arian beliefs provided Gothic rulers with unshakable religious justification for their independence, while simultaneously creating barriers to full integration with Roman society. This wasn't accidental. It was calculated political theology that allowed Gothic leaders to claim divine sanction for their autonomy, while remaining authentically Christian. The missionary activities of Gothic Christians extended far beyond their own communities to influence other Germanic peoples and contribute to the broader Christianization of Europe in ways that most people never realize. Gothic missionaries carried Arian Christianity to the Vandals, Burgundians, and countless other Germanic tribes, creating networks of religious and cultural connection that transcended political boundaries and created lasting alliances across vast distances. The Gothic example of successful Christian conversion, while maintaining complete political independence, provided revolutionary models for other Germanic peoples facing identical challenges. Here was proof that you could embrace Christianity without surrendering your cultural identity or political autonomy to Roman imperial authority. The theological controversies surrounding Arian Christianity continued influencing Gothic-Roman relations throughout the 5th and 6th centuries, creating religious barriers to political cooperation and cultural integration that would echo through medieval history. Roman insistence on Nicene orthodoxy as a prerequisite for full acceptance within the empire meant that Gothic adherence to Arianism remained a constant source of tension even after Gothic establishment within Roman territories. But then everything changed forever with an event that would shatter the Gothic world and reshape the entire political landscape of Europe. The tranquil prosperity that had characterized Gothic territories in the Pontic-Caspian steppe for over a century came to an abrupt and absolutely violent end. During the 370s, with the arrival of a nomadic confederation, whose military capabilities and ruthless efficiency defied everything Europeans thought they knew about warfare. The Huns, emerging from the vast depths of Central Asia with a warrior culture honed by generations of conflict against Chinese and Persian civilizations, and brought military technologies and tactical innovations that rendered traditional Gothic defensive strategies completely obsolete overnight. Their composite bows, capable of penetrating armor at ranges exceeding 300 meters, combined with unmatched mobility and coordination of multiple cavalry armies, created a military machine unlike anything European peoples had ever encountered. The first reports of Hunnic presence reached Gothic settlements through absolutely terrified refugees fleeing from territories east of the Don River, where Hunnic tribes had maintained control for centuries. These initial accounts, dismissed by many Gothic leaders as exaggerated tales from defeated enemies, described horsemen who seemed to live permanently mounted, subsisting on mare's milk and raw meat, while moving with supernatural speed across vast distances that challenged human comprehension. The Hunnic practice of artificial cranial deformation, which created distinctively elongated skulls among their elite warriors, contributed to their fearsome reputation and reinforced perceptions of their otherworldly nature. To Gothic eyes, these weren't just foreign warriors, they appeared to be supernatural beings sent to destroy their world. The Hunnic military organization represented a synthesis of steppe warfare traditions perfected through centuries of conflict across the entire Eurasian landmass. Their armies consisted of decimal units organized into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors, with each level commanded by experienced officers who maintained strict discipline through combinations of rewards and brutal punishments that created absolute loyalty and terrifying effectiveness. The Hunnic communication system, utilizing mounted messengers and signal fires, enabled coordination of forces across distances that would have been impossible for Gothic armies dependent on foot messengers and horn calls. When your enemy can coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles while your forces struggle to communicate across a single battlefield, traditional military strategies become worthless. The technological advantages possessed by Hunnic forces extended far beyond their famous composite bows to encompass sophisticated siege equipment and metallurgical techniques acquired through contact with Chinese and Persian civilizations. Hunnic siege engines, including torsion catapults and battering rams, enabled them to assault fortified positions that had previously provided Gothic communities with security against nomadic raiders. The strategic approach employed by Hunnic commanders demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare and the critical importance of disrupting enemy morale before engaging in direct combat. Hunnic armies typically advanced in multiple columns that maintained communication while creating the impression of omnipresence across vast territories, making defense seem hopeless. The Ostrogothic kingdom of Ermanaric, which had reached its zenith during the mid-4th century, encompassed territories stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and included dozens of tribal groups united under Grüthungi leadership. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals sophisticated political organization capable of coordinating agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and military operations across distances exceeding 1,000 kilometers. Ermanaric himself, described in later Gothic traditions as a ruler of exceptional longevity and wisdom, had spent decades consolidating Ostrogothic control over the Pontic steppes through combinations of military conquest and diplomatic alliance. His court, located between the Dnieper and Don rivers, attracted warriors, craftsmen, and merchants from across Eastern Europe, creating a cosmopolitan center that rivaled contemporary Roman cities in wealth and cultural sophistication. But when the Hunnic assault came during the winter of 375, Miso 376 AD, it arrived with devastating swiftness that caught the Gothic world completely unprepared. The timing demonstrated Hunnic strategic sophistication. Frozen rivers provided highways for cavalry movement, while Gothic defensive preparations were hampered by severe weather conditions that reduced their traditional fighting effectiveness. The Battle of the Dnieper in early 376 AD marked the decisive engagement that destroyed Ostrogothic resistance and led to the collapse of Ermanaric's kingdom forever. When Gothic forces attempted to establish defensive positions along the river's western bank, Hunnic cavalry maintained relentless pressure through constant harassment and feigned retreats that gradually wore down Gothic morale and ammunition supplies. The death of Ermanaric during the battle, whether from combat wounds or suicide as later traditions claimed, symbolized the complete collapse of Ostrogothic resistance and the end of an era in Gothic history that had lasted for centuries. The psychological trauma of losing their legendary king combined with military destruction would influence Gothic collective memory for generations to come. The streams of terrified refugees flooding westward brought something far more dangerous than just first-hand accounts of Hunnic warfare. They brought a contagious panic that spread through Visigothic territories like wildfire, intensifying fears and contributing to a growing sense that their entire world was about to collapse forever. These weren't just distant rumors anymore. These were survivors with haunted eyes describing horrors that challenged everything the Visigoths thought they knew about warfare and survival. The Visigothic response to this unprecedented threat revealed something absolutely crucial about their society that would determine their fate. Unlike the centralized Ostrogothic kingdom that had fallen so catastrophically, Visigothic society remained organized around multiple competing chieftains who struggled desperately to coordinate any kind of unified resistance effort. Picture the chaos. While death approached from the east, Gothic leaders were still arguing about authority and strategy instead of acting with the unity that survival demanded. The democratic traditions of Gothic assemblies, which had provided effective governance during peaceful times, proved completely inadequate for making the rapid, decisive actions required by military crisis. When your enemy moves with supernatural speed and your political system requires lengthy debates before making decisions, you're facing a recipe for disaster that would challenge any civilization. But from this chaos emerged a leader whose name would echo through history. Visigothic King Fritigern, who rose to dominance during this period of crisis through his extraordinary combination of military experience and diplomatic brilliance. His previous conflicts with rival Gothic chieftains had provided him with invaluable knowledge of both Gothic military capabilities and their devastating limitations when confronted by superior enemies like the Huns. Fritigern's cold assessment of Hunnic strength led him to a conclusion that must have been agonizing for a proud Gothic warrior. Successful resistance required either Roman military assistance or complete evacuation to Roman territory, where Gothic populations could regroup and somehow rebuild their shattered strength. This wasn't the decision of a coward. It was the strategic calculation of a leader who understood that pride was worthless if it led to extinction. The internal debates raging within Visigothic society regarding their response to the Hunnic threat revealed fundamental divisions about Gothic identity and their relationship with Roman civilization that had been simmering for generations. Conservative elements led by chieftains like Athalaric advocated for continued resistance from traditional Gothic territories, rejecting any accommodation with Rome that might compromise the Gothic independence their ancestors had died to preserve. Progressive factions, increasingly influenced by Christian conversion and commercial relationships with Roman merchants, viewed cooperation with the empire as the only viable survival strategy available to their people. This wasn't just political disagreement, it was a struggle for the soul of Gothic civilization itself. The religious dimensions of this crisis included rapidly growing Christian influence, and the devastating belief among some Gothic leaders that their traditional pagan gods had proven completely inadequate against the Hunnic threat. When your ancestral deities can't protect you from annihilation, it creates spiritual crises that shake the foundations of entire cultures. The Christian emphasis on divine providence and the possibility of salvation through faith provided alternative explanations for Gothic suffering that competed directly with traditional Germanic concepts of fate and heroic resistance. The conversion of significant portions of the Visigothic population to Arian Christianity during this period reflected both genuine religious conviction and practical calculations about divine protection that might succeed where human weapons had failed. The decision to seek Roman refuge represented a fundamental transformation in Gothic political strategy that marked the beginning of an entirely new phase in Gothic-Roman relations. The traditional Gothic preference for independence and their fierce pride in military prowess made the prospect of seeking imperial protection deeply humiliating for warriors and nobles who had spent their lives proving their strength through combat. But the practical necessities of survival overcame cultural preferences, as reports of continued Hunnic advances made absolutely clear that remaining in their ancestral territories would result in either death or enslavement. Sometimes survival requires swallowing your pride and making choices that contradict everything you've believed about honor and independence. The diplomatic negotiations between Visigothic representatives and Roman officials during 376 AD reveal the incredible complexity of a situation that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Emperor Valens, already preoccupied with Persian threats in the east and internal religious controversies, initially viewed the Gothic request for asylum as a golden opportunity to acquire military recruits and agricultural workers for the empire's chronically underpopulated Balkan provinces. The Roman assessment of Gothic military capabilities, based on their performance in previous conflicts, led imperial officials to catastrophically underestimate the challenges involved in accommodating large numbers of armed barbarians within Roman territory. This miscalculation would prove to be one of the most disastrous policy failures in Roman history. The terms proposed by Roman negotiators reflected both imperial arrogance and practical considerations about managing barbarian populations that revealed just how little Romans understood about Gothic society. The Goths would be permitted to cross the Danube and settle in designated areas of Thrace, but they would be required to surrender their weapons, provide hostages from noble families, and accept Roman administrative oversight of their communities. These conditions, while providing security from Hunnic attack, effectively reduced the Goths from proud independent allies to dependent subjects within the Roman system, a transformation that would create resentments lasting for generations. The crossing of the Danube in late 376 AD involved logistical challenges that strained both Gothic organizational capabilities and Roman administrative resources beyond their breaking points. The Gothic population seeking refuge included not only warriors and their families, but also craftsmen, slaves, livestock, and portable wealth representing the accumulated prosperity of centuries of successful civilization. Roman officials responsible for managing this crossing, primarily concerned with preventing weapon entry and ensuring accurate population counts, proved completely inadequate for handling an operation of such magnitude. The corruption and incompetence of Roman officials, particularly commanders Lupicinus and Maximus, created additional complications as they attempted to profit personally from Gothic desperation. But here's where the situation became truly explosive. The Gothic experience during the crossing process revealed the extent of Roman administrative breakdown and the empire's complete inability to manage the crisis effectively. Families were separated during chaotic river crossings, while inadequate Roman provisions created immediate shortages of food and shelter for Gothic refugees who had trusted Roman promises. The Roman failure to provide promised supplies, combined with their continued demands for weapon surrenders and hostage delivery, convinced many Goths that imperial officials were acting in absolute bad faith. The incident at Marcianopolis, where Roman officials attempted to assassinate Gothic leaders during a supposed diplomatic banquet, provided the immediate catalyst for Gothic rebellion and demonstrated the shocking extent of Roman duplicity. The failure of this assassination attempt, combined with the dramatic Gothic rescue of their threatened leaders, convinced even moderate Goths that cooperation with Rome was impossible. The outbreak of violence that followed marked the beginning of a conflict that would devastate the Balkans and ultimately result in the death of a Roman emperor, consequences that nobody could have imagined when those first desperate refugees crossed the Danube seeking safety. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in makeshift Gothic camps scattered across Thrace during the winter of 376-377 AD created conditions that would transform desperate refugees into a formidable military force capable of challenging Roman imperial authority itself. The systematic exploitation by corrupt Roman officials would soon backfire in ways that would shake the empire to its foundations. The breakdown of Roman supply systems during the brutal winter months created something far more catastrophic than simple inconvenience. It pushed entire Gothic communities toward the absolute brink of starvation in ways that would transform desperate refugees into some of the most dangerous enemies Rome had ever faced. Picture this nightmare scenario. Roman logistical planning that worked perfectly fine for maintaining frontier garrisons numbering in the hundreds suddenly confronted refugee populations exceeding 100,000 individuals who needed food, fuel, and shelter just to survive each passing day. The empire's chronic financial difficulties, already stretched to breaking points by ongoing conflicts with Persia and devastating internal political instability, meant that resources allocated for Gothic support were frequently diverted to other military priorities that Roman administrators considered more pressing than humanitarian aid. This wasn't just bureaucratic incompetence, it was a systematic abandonment of promises that would create enemies more dangerous than any external threat. The social dynamics within Gothic refugee communities underwent revolutionary transformation as traditional hierarchies adapted to the desperate circumstances of displacement in ways that challenged everything they had believed about leadership and authority. The warrior aristocracy, suddenly stripped of their territorial bases and reduced to complete dependence on Roman charity, struggled desperately to maintain authority over followers who faced immediate threats to their very survival. But here's what makes this situation absolutely explosive. The democratic traditions of Gothic assemblies became forums for increasingly radical discussions about resistance to Roman authority, with younger warriors advocating for immediate violent action against their oppressors. When your people are starving and your leaders can't provide basic protection, traditional respect for authority starts crumbling fast. From this chaos emerged a leader whose strategic brilliance would challenge the Roman Empire itself. Fritigern, whose rise to dominance during this crisis reflected both his exceptional military experience and his remarkable ability to articulate Gothic grievances in terms that resonated with diverse tribal groups facing extinction. His leadership style combined traditional Germanic concepts of warrior kingship with pragmatic assessment of Roman military capabilities and political weaknesses that others had failed to recognize. Fritigern's strategic thinking recognized something that would prove absolutely crucial. Gothic survival required not merely escape from Roman oppression, but the establishment of secure territorial bases, where Gothic communities could rebuild their strength and defend themselves permanently. This wasn't just about ending immediate suffering. It was about creating a future where Goths could live with dignity and independence. The religious dimensions of Gothic resistance included the rapidly growing influence of Arian Christianity and its powerful emphasis on divine justice for the oppressed, that provided spiritual justification for actions that might otherwise seem impossible. Gothic Christian leaders, trained in biblical interpretation and intimately familiar with stories of divine deliverance, provided theological justification for resistance against Roman persecution that maintained their religious identity while supporting rebellion. The Christian concept of righteous warfare against ungodly oppressors offered Gothic warriors moral legitimacy for their rebellion, while keeping them connected to the broader Christian world, a brilliant synthesis that combined spiritual conviction with practical military necessity. Then came the incident at Marcianopolis in early 377 AD that would transform Gothic discontent into open rebellion forever. Roman officials, apparently coordinated by Lupicinus and designed to eliminate Gothic leadership through absolute treachery, attempted to assassinate Gothic leaders during what was supposed to be a diplomatic banquet. This wasn't just political miscalculation, it was the complete breakdown of diplomatic relations that proved Roman duplicity beyond any possible doubt. The failure of this assassination attempt, combined with the dramatic Gothic rescue of their threatened leaders, convinced even the most moderate Goths that cooperation with Rome was absolutely impossible. When your supposed allies try to murder your leaders during peace negotiations, trust becomes impossible, and violence becomes inevitable. The outbreak of violence following the Marcianopolis incident revealed something that must have terrified Roman administrators: the extent of Gothic military preparation and their sophisticated ability to coordinate resistance activities across multiple refugee camps scattered throughout Thrace. Gothic warriors, despite Roman restrictions on their movement, had maintained communication networks that enabled rapid mobilization of forces throughout the entire province. The simultaneous uprising of Gothic communities across Thrace demonstrated planning and organization that completely surprised Roman officials who had catastrophically underestimated Gothic capabilities. This wasn't spontaneous rebellion, it was coordinated revolution that had been carefully planned and executed with precision that rivaled Roman military operations. Initial Gothic military operations focused on securing weapons and supplies necessary for sustained resistance against Roman authority through systematic attacks on Roman armories, supply depots and administrative centers, while avoiding direct confrontation with major Roman military units. Their intimate knowledge of local geography, acquired through months of forced residence in the region, provided significant advantages in conducting guerrilla operations against Roman forces, completely unfamiliar with the terrain. The Roman military response to Gothic rebellion revealed the empire's chronic manpower shortages and the shocking poor quality of frontier troops available for immediate deployment. The Danubian legions, weakened by years of budget cuts and recruitment difficulties, lacked the training and equipment necessary for effective counterinsurgency operations against enemies who understood Roman weaknesses better than Romans understood their own strengths. The Gothic adoption of Roman military equipment and techniques accelerated rapidly as their forces captured imperial armories and recruited Roman deserters to their cause in ways that created hybrid forces combining barbarian mobility and aggression with imperial discipline and organization. Gothic warriors began wearing Roman armor and carrying Roman weapons while maintaining their traditional tactical preferences and command structures, creating combinations that were more effective than either system alone. The expansion of Gothic territorial control during 377 AD demonstrated their remarkable ability to establish effective administration over conquered Roman territories through occupation of major cities, including Adrianople, Philippopolis, and Nicopolis, while establishing fortified camps that served as bases for further military operations. Emperor Valens, preoccupied with Persian threats in the east, initially sought to end the Gothic rebellion through political settlement rather than military conquest, offering expanded settlement rights and increased subsidies that demonstrated imperial willingness to make significant concessions to restore stability in the Balkans. But Gothic rejection of Roman diplomatic overtures reflected their growing confidence in their military capabilities and their absolute determination to achieve genuine independence rather than merely improved conditions of subjugation. Fritigern's demands included recognition of Gothic territorial autonomy, removal of corrupt Roman officials, and guarantees of religious freedom for Arian Christians, demands completely incompatible with Roman concepts of imperial sovereignty. The military preparations undertaken by both sides during the winter of 377–378 AD revealed the scale and significance of the coming conflict that would determine the fate of both civilizations. Emperor Valens assembled approximately 20,000 men representing one of the largest Roman armies deployed in the Balkans during the 4th century, demonstrating imperial determination to crush Gothic resistance definitively. Meanwhile, Fritigern established unified command structure that integrated various tribal groups while maintaining their traditional fighting methods, creating a Gothic army that included not only warriors from the original refugee population, but also recruits from other barbarian groups and Roman deserters who provided crucial technical expertise. As both armies approached the fateful confrontation at Adrianople in August 378 AD, under conditions of extreme heat and logistical strain, the stage was set for a battle that would change European history forever. The Gothic defensive position, protected by a circular arrangement of wagons borrowed from steppe nomadic traditions, occupied elevated ground that provided defensive advantages while limiting Roman options for flanking maneuvers. The composition of the Gothic army reflected the diverse nature of forces that had joined Fritigern's rebellion. Traditional Germanic infantry hardened by 2 years of constant warfare, combined with Sarmatian heavy cavalry units whose shock capabilities could break Roman infantry formations through coordinated mounted charges that would challenge everything Romans thought they knew about barbarian warfare. The Roman tactical approach at Adrianople represented everything the empire believed made them invincible: disciplined infantry formations supported by cavalry and artillery, in arrangements that had dominated battlefields for centuries. Picture this massive war machine. Heavy infantry legions deployed in the center like an unstoppable steel wall, with auxiliary units and allied barbarian forces positioned on the flanks to provide flexibility and local knowledge that complemented Roman discipline. The Roman cavalry, positioned on the wings according to centuries of military doctrine, was intended to protect infantry flanks while seeking opportunities to exploit any Gothic weaknesses that might develop during the battle. This wasn't just military tradition. It was a tactical system that had conquered most of the known world through superior organization and coordinated unit movements. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn that reveals the complexity of ancient warfare. The initial phase of the battle began not with immediate violence, but with Roman attempts to negotiate a settlement while maintaining military pressure on Gothic positions. Emperor Valens, despite commanding one of the largest armies Rome had assembled in decades, recognized the incredible strength of the Gothic defensive position and sought to avoid costly frontal assaults through diplomatic means. Think about the strategic brilliance here, offering terms that might divide Gothic leadership and reduce their fighting effectiveness while keeping your army positioned to strike if negotiations failed. The Roman negotiating strategy reflected both genuine desire to minimize casualties and cold tactical calculations about the advantages of fighting a weakened enemy rather than a unified one. But the Gothic response to Roman diplomatic overtures demonstrated something that must have chilled Roman hearts: absolute confidence in their military position and unwavering determination to achieve decisive victory rather than temporary accommodation. Fritigern's rejection of Roman terms combined with his demand for complete Gothic independence made crystal clear that this conflict could only be resolved through military action. The breakdown of negotiations eliminated any possibility of peaceful resolution and committed both sides to a battle that would determine the fate of European civilization itself. When diplomacy fails and two massive armies face each other across a battlefield, the stakes couldn't be higher. The Roman assault on the Gothic Wagenlager began with coordinated attacks by infantry and cavalry units, designed to overwhelm Gothic defences through superior numbers and equipment that had never failed before. The Roman legions, advancing in traditional formation with shields locked and spears levelled, initially made progress against Gothic defensive positions in ways that must have seemed to confirm Roman expectations of inevitable victory. The disciplined advance of Roman heavy infantry, supported by artillery bombardments that rained destruction on Gothic positions, created breaches in the Gothic perimeter that threatened to collapse their entire defensive system. For those crucial moments, it looked like Roman military superiority would triumph once again through methods that had worked for generations. But then came the decisive moment that changed everything forever. Gothic cavalry forces, returning from foraging operations at exactly the right time, struck the exposed Roman right flank while it was engaged in assaulting the wagon fortifications. Picture the absolute chaos. Gothic horsemen led by Sarmatian cataphracts and supported by traditional Germanic cavalry charging into Roman formations with devastating effect that no one had anticipated. The impact of armoured cavalry against infantry caught in the act of assault created immediate chaos in Roman ranks and completely disrupted their tactical coordination. This wasn't just military defeat, it was the collapse of a system that had seemed invincible for centuries. The collapse of Roman formation integrity following the Gothic cavalry charge led to widespread panic, as individual units found themselves surrounded and cut off from mutual support. The Roman army, which had maintained discipline during the initial assault, disintegrated as soldiers abandoned their positions and fled in disorder that spread like wildfire through their ranks. The Gothic infantry, emerging from their defensive positions like warriors released from hell itself, joined the cavalry in pursuing the retreating Romans and completing the destruction of imperial forces in scenes that defied everything Romans thought they knew about barbarian capabilities. Emperor Valens died during the chaotic retreat that followed the Gothic breakthrough, struck down while attempting to rally his collapsing forces in one final desperate effort to save his empire. The death of the emperor in battle represented an unprecedented disaster for Roman prestige and demonstrated the complete collapse of imperial authority in the face of barbarian military superiority that shocked the ancient world. The immediate aftermath of Adrianople witnessed something that would have been unimaginable just hours earlier: the complete disintegration of Roman military power in the Balkans and the establishment of Gothic control over vast territories previously under imperial administration. The Gothic victory provided them with enormous quantities of military equipment, including weapons, armour and siege engines that would enhance their capabilities for future operations. The political consequences of Valens's death created a succession crisis that paralysed Roman response to the Gothic victory and prevented effective imperial counteraction when rapid response was absolutely crucial. The absence of clear succession arrangements, combined with the destruction of much of the Eastern Field Army, left the empire vulnerable to further Gothic expansion and unable to mount immediate military operations to restore imperial control. The catastrophic defeat at Adrianople fundamentally transformed the relationship between Gothic peoples and the Roman Empire, creating conditions that would eventually lead to the establishment of the first successful barbarian kingdom within former imperial territory. The immediate aftermath left the Eastern Empire in political chaos, with no clear succession mechanism and the majority of its field army destroyed on the Thracian plains. The new emperor Theodosius I, who assumed power in 379 AD, faced the daunting task of rebuilding imperial military strength, while simultaneously containing Gothic expansion throughout the Balkans. The Gothic Confederation under Fritigern's leadership had evolved far beyond its origins as a desperate refugee population into a sophisticated military and political organization capable of governing conquered territories. The victory at Adrianople had demonstrated to both Goths and Romans that barbarian forces could not only defeat imperial armies, but completely destroy them, fundamentally altering the psychological dynamics of Gothic-Roman relations forever. The territorial situation saw Gothic forces controlling much of Thrace and portions of Moesia, with their influence extending across approximately 50,000 square kilometers of formerly Roman territory. But then Fritigund's death in 380 AD created a succession crisis within the Gothic Confederation that threatened to fragment their military and political unity just when their success seemed complete. The traditional Germanic method of selecting leaders through assembly consensus proved inadequate for managing the complex political situation created by their territorial conquests. Theodosius the Great's response demonstrated both pragmatic assessment of imperial limitations and innovative approaches to barbarian management. Rather than attempting to crush Gothic resistance through direct military confrontation, which had proved disastrously unsuccessful under Valens, the new emperor pursued a policy of negotiated settlement that would transform Gothic raiders into Roman allies. The negotiations during 381–382 AD resulted in the first formal Foedus agreement that established the legal framework for barbarian settlement within Roman territory. This treaty recognized Gothic territorial autonomy within designated areas while requiring them to provide military service under their own commanders, a fundamental departure from traditional Roman policy that had always insisted on complete barbarian submission. The terms reflected the new realities of power following Adrianople while maintaining face-saving formalities for Roman dignity. The Goths would retain their weapons, maintain traditional leadership structures, and govern their territories according to their own laws, while the Empire provided annual subsidies and guaranteed Gothic territorial integrity. This revolutionary arrangement would require significant adjustments from both populations as they adapted to entirely new forms of coexistence that had never been attempted before in Roman history. The transformation happening across Gothic territories was nothing short of revolutionary. These weren't temporary refugee camps anymore, but permanent settlements that would reshape European civilization forever. Gothic communities established fortified towns and agricultural villages that represented something entirely new in European history, a brilliant fusion of traditional Germanic building techniques with Roman architectural elements that created architectural styles never seen before. Picture walking through these incredible settlements, where archaeological evidence from sites like Nicopolis at Istrum reveals Gothic communities featuring timber-framed houses built on solid stone foundations, sophisticated craft workshops, and Christian churches that demonstrate the extraordinary cultural synthesis emerging from this unprecedented period. These weren't just functional buildings, they were statements about Gothic identity and their determination to create something uniquely their own, while respecting the achievements of Roman civilization. The Gothic military obligations under the Foedus Agreement created something absolutely fascinating. Barbarian warriors serving alongside Roman legions while maintaining their traditional fighting methods and command structures. Think about the complexity here. Gothic warriors found themselves fighting Persian forces, Danubian tribes, and other barbarian groups as Roman allies, demonstrating their incredible value as military partners while simultaneously gaining invaluable experience in Roman tactical methods. This integration of Gothic and Roman forces created hybrid military units that combined barbarian mobility and aggression with imperial discipline and organization in ways that were more effective than either system alone. These weren't just temporary military partnerships, they were the foundation of an entirely new form of European warfare that would influence military development for centuries. But here's where things get really interesting. The religious dimensions of Gothic settlement within Roman territory involved incredibly complex negotiations between Arian and Nicene Christian communities that required diplomatic skills of the highest order. The Gothic adherence to Arian Christianity, which denied the full divinity of Christ and rejected the Nicene Creed, created theological tensions with Roman populations and imperial authorities that could have exploded into violent conflict. However, the practical necessities of maintaining political stability led to official tolerance of Gothic religious practices, while encouraging gradual conversion to Orthodox Christianity through missionary activities and intermarriage, a delicate balancing act that required constant attention and careful management from leaders on both sides. The economic integration of Gothic communities within the Roman system created revolutionary new patterns of trade and resource utilization that benefited both populations in ways that exceeded anyone's expectations. Gothic agricultural production, particularly grain cultivation and livestock raising, helped address chronic food shortages in the Balkans, while providing Gothic communities with surplus products for profitable trade relationships. Gothic craftsmen skilled in metalwork and textile production found ready markets for their goods in Roman cities, while adopting Roman techniques and decorative styles that created entirely new artistic traditions. This wasn't just economic cooperation, it was cultural fusion happening in real time that would influence European art and commerce for generations. The political evolution of Gothic society under the feudal system reflected their remarkable adaptation to governing settled territories while maintaining their traditional cultural identity. Gothic kings and chieftains established courts that combined Germanic assembly traditions with Roman administrative practices, creating governmental institutions capable of managing complex territorial and diplomatic responsibilities that would have challenged the most experienced Roman administrators. The emergence of Gothic legal codes that integrated traditional Germanic law with Roman legal principles demonstrated the sophisticated nature of this cultural synthesis that was creating entirely new forms of European governance. The success of this initial feudus arrangement encouraged similar agreements with other barbarian groups and established precedents for barbarian settlement that would influence imperial policy throughout the 5th century. The Gothic example proved that barbarian peoples could be transformed from destructive raiders into valuable allies through appropriate political arrangements and territorial concessions, a lesson that would reshape Roman policy toward all barbarian groups. But then everything changed with the emergence of Alaric during the 390 AD, marking a completely new phase in Gothic-Roman relations characterized by increasing Gothic assertiveness and territorial ambitions that would challenge everything both civilizations thought they understood about their relationship. Alaric's background as a Roman military officer who had served in imperial campaigns provided him with intimate knowledge of Roman military capabilities and political weaknesses that made him incredibly dangerous. His leadership style combined traditional Germanic warrior culture with sophisticated understanding of Roman diplomatic and administrative systems in ways that created unprecedented opportunities for Gothic expansion. The Gothic military campaigns under Alaric's leadership demonstrated their complete evolution from desperate refugees to a formidable military force capable of challenging Roman authority throughout the Mediterranean world. The Gothic army had grown substantially through recruitment of additional barbarian groups and Roman deserters, while their military capabilities had been enhanced through acquisition of Roman siege equipment and training in imperial tactical methods. The invasion of Italy in 401 AD represented Alaric's most ambitious undertaking and demonstrated Gothic capabilities for strategic planning and execution on an unprecedented scale that shocked the Roman world. Picture this incredible achievement. Gothic forces numbering approximately 30,000 warriors plus their families and support personnel crossed the Alps during winter conditions that had previously been considered impossible for large armies. The logistical achievements required for this operation, including transportation of siege equipment and supplies across treacherous mountain passes, indicated organizational capabilities that rivaled those of the most experienced Roman armies. This wasn't just military bravado, it was systematic planning and execution that demonstrated Gothic transformation into a truly formidable civilization. The Siege of Milan in 402 AD revealed the full extent of Gothic military development and their complete mastery of Roman siege techniques. Gothic forces surrounded the city with elaborate earthworks and siege lines that demonstrated their ability to conduct complex engineering operations requiring thousands of workers and sophisticated coordination. The Gothic employment of battering rams, siege towers, and catapults showed their adaptation of Roman military technology while maintaining their traditional emphasis on mobility and aggressive tactics that created combinations more effective than either approach alone. The siege's duration of several months indicated Gothic logistical capabilities and their absolute confidence in their ability to maintain large forces in enemy territory. The Battle of Pollentia in 402 AD demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Gothic military organization had achieved through years of constant warfare and adaptation. The Gothic battle formation combined traditional Germanic infantry tactics with cavalry units that included both Germanic horsemen and Sarmatian cataphracts, creating flexible forces capable of responding to any battlefield situation. But the ultimate demonstration of Gothic power came with the sack of Rome in 410 AD, the culmination of Gothic military and political development under Alaric's brilliant leadership. The capture of the Eternal City, which had not fallen to foreign enemies for over 800 years, demonstrated the complete transformation of Gothic society from refugee population to conquering power that would reshape European history. The three-day occupation provided the Goths with enormous quantities of gold, silver, and precious objects that would finance their subsequent military operations and territorial expansion for decades. But perhaps most remarkably, the Gothic treatment of Rome during the sack revealed their sophisticated understanding of political symbolism and their desire to present themselves as legitimate successors to Roman authority rather than mere barbarian destroyers. Alaric's forces respected Christian churches and clergy, while systematically looting pagan temples and imperial palaces, a selective approach that demonstrated Gothic political calculations about maintaining support from Christian populations while eliminating symbols of imperial resistance. The immediate consequences included the collapse of imperial prestige throughout the Western Mediterranean, an acceleration of barbarian settlement within Roman territories that would transform the entire political landscape of Europe. Following Alaric's death in 410 AD, Gothic migration to southern Gaul reflected their strategic assessment of territorial opportunities and their determination to establish permanent settlement in fertile agricultural regions. The establishment of Gothic settlements in Toulouse and surrounding territories during 418 AD marked the beginning of the Visigothic kingdom as a permanent political entity that would survive for nearly 3 centuries. The expansion into Hispania during the 450 CES represented the natural extension of their territorial ambitions and their response to opportunities created by the collapse of Roman authority in the peninsula. The Gothic invasion of Spain occurred at Roman invitation to suppress rebellions and contain other barbarian kingdoms, but gradually evolved into permanent occupation as they established control over major cities and agricultural regions throughout the peninsula. The Suevic kingdom established in Galicia during the early 5th century represented something that would terrify any Gothic leader, a substantial military power possessing territorial resources that made them absolutely formidable opponents in ways that challenged everything the Visigoths thought they understood about Iberian politics. Picture this: while the Goths were consolidating their power in southern territories, an entirely different barbarian civilization was building strength in the rugged northwestern regions of the peninsula. The Gothic campaigns against the Suebi required sustained military operations over incredibly difficult terrain that tested every aspect of their military capabilities, while simultaneously demonstrating their remarkable ability to conduct complex strategic operations without losing control over their existing territories. This wasn't just simple conquest. It was sophisticated multi-front warfare that required incredible organizational skills and strategic planning. But here's what makes the Visigothic achievement truly extraordinary. Their conquest of Vandal territories in southern Spain eliminated their most dangerous rivals, while establishing Gothic control over the peninsula's richest agricultural regions in ways that would transform their entire civilization. The Vandals, who had established a powerful kingdom in Baetica during the 420 SAD, possessed naval capabilities and African connections that made them particularly threatening to Gothic interests in ways that went far beyond simple territorial competition. The Gothic military success against the Vandals demonstrated their tactical superiority and their incredible ability to coordinate land and naval operations, something that most barbarian peoples had never successfully accomplished. When you can defeat enemies who control both land and sea routes, you've achieved military capabilities that rival the greatest empires in history. The establishment of Toledo as the Visigothic capital during the late 5th century reflected their brilliant recognition of the city's strategic importance and its powerful symbolic significance as the former center of Roman administration in Spain. This wasn't just choosing a convenient location, it was a calculated political statement about Gothic legitimacy and their determination to present themselves as true successors to Roman authority. The Gothic occupation of Toledo provided them with something invaluable: access to the peninsula's administrative records, legal traditions, and governmental institutions that would prove absolutely crucial for establishing effective rule over their incredibly diverse territories. The city's central location enabled Gothic rulers to maintain control over both their Gallic and Spanish territories, while coordinating military operations across vast distances that would challenge modern military planners. The development of Visigothic legal codes during the 6th and 7th centuries represents one of their most significant contributions to European civilization and demonstrates their sophisticated approach to governing diverse populations in ways that created lasting influence on medieval law. The Breviary of Alaric, promulgated in 506 AD, provided a simplified version of Roman law adapted for use by both Gothic and Roman populations within the kingdom. This legal compilation demonstrated Gothic recognition of the importance of legal continuity and their desire to maintain Roman governmental traditions while adapting them to Germanic cultural practices, a synthesis that required incredible intellectual sophistication and cultural sensitivity. The Libera Judiciorum, completed during the reign of Recusar Winth in 654 AD, represented the culmination of Visigothic legal development and created a unified legal system that applied to all inhabitants of the kingdom regardless of their ethnic background. This comprehensive legal code addressed criminal law, civil disputes, commercial regulations, and family relationships, while incorporating both Germanic and Roman legal traditions in ways that created entirely new forms of European jurisprudence. The administrative system developed by Visigothic rulers combined Germanic political traditions with Roman bureaucratic practices to create governmental institutions capable of managing territories that extended from the Loire River to Gibraltar, an administrative achievement that rivaled anything accomplished by the Roman Empire itself. Gothic kings established hierarchies of appointed officials who administered justice, collected taxes, and maintained military forces throughout the kingdom, while integrating Roman administrative personnel with Gothic nobles in ways that created governmental continuity with imperial traditions, while adapting to Germanic political culture. The gradual integration of Gothic and Hispano-Roman populations occurred through intermarriage, religious conversion, and shared participation in governmental and military institutions that created one of the most successful examples of cultural fusion in medieval Europe. The initial prohibition on intermarriage between Goths and Romans, established to maintain ethnic distinctions, gradually broke down as practical considerations and political alliances encouraged integration that would transform both cultures. The conversion of the Visigothic royal family to Catholic Christianity during the late 6th century eliminated the primary religious barrier to integration and facilitated the emergence of a unified Spanish Christian culture that would influence European development for centuries. But while the Visigoths were consolidating their power in Spain, their Ostrogothic cousins had been following a dramatically different path that would lead to one of the most remarkable cultural achievements of the early medieval period. The Ostrogoths, who had remained under Hunnic domination for nearly a century following the collapse of Ermenaric's kingdom, had gradually rebuilt their strength and identity within the complex political landscape of the late 5th century. The emergence of Theodoric as the dominant figure among the Ostrogoths occurred against the backdrop of Byzantine political maneuvering and the ongoing struggle for control over the Italian peninsula that would reshape European politics forever. Born around 454 AD, Theodoric had spent his youth as a hostage in Constantinople, where he received a Roman education and gained intimate knowledge of imperial administrative practices and diplomatic protocols. This unique background, combining Gothic warrior traditions with Byzantine sophistication, would prove crucial in his later achievements as both military commander and political leader who could navigate the complex world of late imperial politics while maintaining authentic Gothic identity. The decade of the 480s witnessed the Theodoric's remarkable consolidation of power among the various Ostrogothic groups scattered across the Balkans, as he systematically eliminated rivals and unified the disparate tribal fragments into a coherent military force capable of challenging the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. The relationship between Theodoric and Emperor Zeno of Byzantium evolved from mutual suspicion to strategic partnership, as both leaders recognized the incredible advantages of cooperation. Zeno, faced with the challenge of maintaining control over Italy while dealing with Persian threats and internal rebellions, saw in Theodoric a potential solution to the problem of Odoacer's independent kingdom. The negotiations that led to Theodoric's Italian expedition in 489 AD reflected the complex political calculations of both Byzantine and Gothic leaders who understood that success would reshape the entire balance of power in Europe. The formal agreement granted Theodoric the authority to invade Italy and depose Odoacer in the emperor's name, with the understanding that successful conquest would result in Theodoric's recognition as imperial representative in the peninsula. The Ostrogothic invasion of Italy began with a massive migration that included not only Theodoric's warriors, but also their families, livestock, and portable possessions, indicating the Gothic intention to establish permanent settlement rather than conduct temporary raids. The Gothic force, numbering approximately 100,000 individuals, including roughly 20,000 warriors, represented one of the largest barbarian migrations of the late imperial period. The military campaigns against Odoacer's forces revealed tactical innovations that had evolved within Ostrogothic military organization during their decades of service as Byzantine foederati. The Gothic army combined traditional Germanic infantry tactics with cavalry techniques learned from Hunnic and Sarmatian peoples, while incorporating Roman siege equipment and engineering methods that created incredibly effective fighting forces. The Siege of Ravenna, lasting from 491 to 493 AD, demonstrated both the persistence of Gothic military pressure and the sophisticated nature of their strategic planning that would ultimately establish one of the most successful barbarian kingdoms in European history. The Gothic forces constructed elaborate siege works that surrounded the city with fortified camps connected by communication trenches and supply lines that functioned like a miniature city devoted entirely to warfare. The resolution through negotiated surrender, rather than military assault, reflected Theodoric's preference for political solutions that would minimize destruction and facilitate the integration of Italian populations into his emerging kingdom, a strategy that would create one of the most prosperous and culturally sophisticated civilizations of the early medieval period. Picture this. It's 493 AD, and two powerful leaders are sitting down for what they think will be a peaceful dinner. One of them won't be leaving alive. This isn't just another medieval power struggle. This is the moment that would reshape an entire kingdom and change the course of European history forever. When Odoacer finally gave up his fight against the Ostrogoths, the surrender terms seemed almost too good to be true. Both leaders would share power, ruling together in harmony. It looked like a perfect compromise, the kind of deal that showed these Gothic warriors weren't just brutal conquerors, but sophisticated politicians who understood that keeping governments running smoothly was just as important as winning battles. But Theodoric had different plans brewing beneath that diplomatic smile. During what should have been a celebration banquet, Odoacer met his end in the most shocking way possible. One moment he's toasting to shared leadership, the next he's face down in his dinner plate. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated, ruthless, and absolutely brilliant from a political standpoint. Theodoric had just sent a crystal clear message to anyone thinking about challenging his authority. Cooperation was optional, but submission wasn't. The choice of Ravenna as the new Gothic capital wasn't just about finding a pretty place to build a palace. This city was the ultimate strategic goldmine, and Theodoric knew exactly what he was getting his hands on. Think of Ravenna as the medieval equivalent of inheriting both Fort Knox and the Pentagon rolled into one incredible package. Here's what made Ravenna absolutely perfect. It had been the beating heart of Roman power in the West for decades. All those government records, legal documents, and administrative systems that had kept Italy running, they were all sitting right there, waiting for someone smart enough to use them. Theodoric didn't just conquer a city mined, he inherited an entire governmental infrastructure that would have taken decades to build from scratch. But the location itself was pure genius from a military perspective. Picture a city completely surrounded by treacherous marshes that would swallow enemy armies whole, yet connected to the Adriatic Sea for trade and communication. It was like having a fortress that enemies couldn't reach, but friends and merchants could visit anytime they wanted. Theodoric had found the perfect blend of security and accessibility. Now here's where things get really fascinating. Instead of throwing out everything Roman and starting over, Theodoric created something completely revolutionary. He built a hybrid system that was part Gothic warrior culture, part Roman bureaucratic efficiency. It was like taking the best features from two completely different operating systems and somehow making them work together flawlessly. The existing Roman administrative structure stayed in place, but now Gothic nobles occupied all the key military and governmental positions. Romans got to keep their familiar systems and procedures, while Goths maintained complete political control. It was a masterpiece of political engineering that satisfied both groups while keeping the kingdom running like a well-oiled machine. Even more impressive was Theodoric's approach to Roman law. Instead of imposing some crude barbarian legal system, he kept the existing Roman legal codes and judicial procedures exactly as they were. Why? Because he understood something that many conquerors miss entirely: people need legal stability to feel secure, and secure people are productive people. When business owners and farmers know the rules won't change overnight, they're willing to invest, build, and grow the economy. The religious situation could have been a complete disaster, but Theodoric turned it into one of his greatest political victories. Here you had a kingdom split between Catholic Christians and Arian Christians, Morse, two groups that typically couldn't stand being in the same room together, let alone the same country. Religious wars were tearing apart other barbarian kingdoms left and right. But Theodoric found a way to thread this impossible needle. He officially tolerated Catholic Christianity while simultaneously protecting Arian churches and clergy. It was like being a referee in a boxing match where both fighters agreed to follow completely different rules and somehow making it work for everyone involved. This wasn't just smart politics, it was genius-level social engineering. While other kingdoms were burning themselves to the ground over religious differences, Theodoric's Italy enjoyed unprecedented religious peace. Catholics could worship freely, Arians maintained their churches, and nobody was getting executed for their theological opinions. The economic transformation that followed was nothing short of miraculous. After decades of political chaos, warfare, and economic collapse, Italy suddenly started booming again. Cities that had been struggling to survive began growing rapidly. Trade routes that had been abandoned reopened. Agricultural production increased dramatically. It was like watching a patient recover from a near-fatal illness and emerge stronger than before. Archaeological evidence from this period tells an incredible story of revival and growth. Construction projects exploded across Italian cities. Craftspeople who had barely survived during the chaos were suddenly overwhelmed with orders. Commercial networks that had been dormant for decades came roaring back to life. This wasn't just economic recovery, it was economic renaissance. What made this possible was Theodoric's brilliant combination of political stability, administrative efficiency, and protective policies. He restored Roman tax collection systems but used the revenue wisely. He protected agricultural production while encouraging commercial activity. He created conditions where people felt safe enough to plan for the future, and secure people always find ways to prosper. What happens when a legendary king dies and leaves behind only a child to rule an empire? You're about to discover how one of history's most successful kingdoms crumbled in just a few decades, setting the stage for one of the most brutal and devastating wars the ancient world had ever seen. When Theodoric died in 526 AD, his grandson Athalaric was still just a boy. Picture trying to run a complex kingdom when you're barely old enough to understand what a kingdom even is. The real power fell into the hands of his mother, Amalasuntha, who found herself trying to hold together a political system that had only worked because of one man's extraordinary personal authority. This regency period was like blood in the water for political sharks. Gothic nobles who had been kept in line by Theodoric's iron grip suddenly saw opportunities everywhere. Roman populations began whispering about liberation, and far away in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian was watching every development with the hungry eyes of a predator sizing up wounded prey. The kingdom that had seemed unshakable under Theodoric revealed its fatal flaw. It had been built around one man's genius rather than lasting institutions. Without that towering personality holding everything together, cracks began appearing everywhere. Internal opposition grew bolder by the day, while external enemies started making their plans. But here's where the story takes a dark turn that would change everything. In 535 AD, Amalasuntha met her end at the hands of her own cousin Theodahad, who saw murdering his relative as his ticket to absolute power. What Theodahad didn't realize was that he had just handed Emperor Justinian the perfect excuse for what he'd been planning all along: the complete destruction of the Gothic kingdom. Justinian wasn't just any emperor. This was a man obsessed with a single consuming vision: restoring the Roman Empire to its ancient glory by reconquering every territory that had been lost to barbarian kingdoms. Italy, with its weakened leadership and political chaos, looked like the perfect place to start this grand imperial restoration. The emperor's decision to launch the reconquest wasn't just about military opportunity, it was about rewriting history itself. He genuinely believed he could turn back the clock, eliminate these Germanic kingdoms, and restore the Roman world to its former magnificence. It was an incredibly ambitious dream that would turn into an absolute nightmare for everyone involved. Justinian's master plan began with a stroke of military genius. Instead of attacking Italy directly, his brilliant general Belisarius landed in Sicily with just 7,500 carefully chosen troops. This wasn't a massive invasion force. It was a precision strike designed to establish the perfect launching pad for the real war to come. Sicily fell so quickly it was almost embarrassing. The Gothic garrisons were undermanned, undersupplied, and completely unprepared for Byzantine military efficiency. Local populations, tired of Gothic rule, actually welcomed these new invaders as liberators. Within months, Justinian controlled the entire island and had a secure base for the next phase of his master plan. The ease of this victory created a dangerous illusion. Justinian convinced himself that conquering all of Italy would be just as simple, requiring minimal resources and taking maybe 2 or 3 years at most. It was the kind of strategic miscalculation that would haunt him for the next 2 decades. When Belisarius moved his forces onto the Italian mainland in 536 AD, reality hit hard. The Gothic king Theodore had, despite being considered weak and indecisive, had managed to organize serious defensive preparations. Gothic forces had fortified key cities, concentrated their armies in strategic positions, and developed a defensive strategy that would make every mile of Byzantine advance incredibly costly. The siege of Naples became a showcase for the sophisticated military technology that made Byzantine forces so deadly. Belisarius employed elaborate siege engines, specialized earthworks, and Hunnic horse archers whose mobility and firepower completely overwhelmed traditional Gothic tactics. When Naples finally fell after weeks of brutal fighting, it sent shockwaves throughout the Gothic kingdom. But the real prize was Rome itself. In December 536 AD, Belisarius achieved what seemed impossible. He captured the Eternal City with minimal resistance. The Gothic garrison was demoralized and outnumbered, while the Roman population actively helped the Byzantines secure control. After decades of Gothic rule, many Romans still remembered imperial authority and welcomed its return with open arms. The capture of Rome gave Justinian incredible propaganda value, but it also triggered a Gothic response that nobody saw coming. A new king named Witiges had seized power from the ineffective Theodore, and he was about to prove that the Goths were far from finished. Witiges assembled something absolutely unprecedented, a Gothic army of roughly 30,000 warriors that included not just traditional Gothic fighters, but Burgundian allies and various other Germanic groups who understood that Byzantine expansion threatened all of them. This was one of the largest barbarian armies ever assembled in the 6th century, and it was marching straight toward Rome. The siege of Rome from 537 to 538 AD became an epic confrontation that showcased medieval warfare at its most sophisticated and brutal. Witiges surrounded the Eternal City with fortified camps connected by communication trenches and supply lines. Gothic forces employed siege engines constructed by Roman engineers who had joined their cause, turning imperial technology against the empire itself. But Belisarius was ready for them. This military genius transformed Rome's ancient walls into a cutting-edge defensive system with new artillery positions and reinforced gates. He used mounted archers and heavy cavalry in coordinated sorties that kept Gothic forces constantly off balance while protecting the city's defensive perimeter. The Goths tried everything, including cutting off Rome's water supply by destroying the ancient aqueducts. It was environmental warfare at its most ruthless, and if they couldn't take the city by force, they'd make it uninhabitable. Roman civilians found themselves relying on wells and the Tiber River, creating sanitation nightmares that threatened to accomplish what Gothic weapons couldn't. When Byzantine reinforcements arrived under General Narses in 538 AD, the tide turned decisively. The combined Byzantine assault from multiple directions overwhelmed Gothic defensive positions and forced Witiges to abandon his elaborate siege works. The Gothic withdrawal marked the failure of their most ambitious attempt to recapture Rome and demonstrated the superiority of Byzantine military coordination. The campaigns of 539 and 540 AD witnessed the systematic destruction of Gothic strongholds throughout central and northern Italy. Cities that had stood for centuries fell to sophisticated Byzantine siege operations. The Gothic strategy of defensive warfare proved completely inadequate against an enemy with superior siege equipment and unlimited time to conduct methodical operations. Just when it seemed like the Gothic kingdom was finished forever, a leader emerged who would prove that reports of Gothic death had been greatly exaggerated. King Attila, whose name literally meant immortal in Gothic, would demonstrate that this war was far from over. His charismatic leadership and innovative strategies would soon recapture much of central Italy, proving that the Goths still had plenty of fight left in them. Within just 3 years, an entire civilization vanished from the map. The speed of the Islamic conquest that swept across Spain was so breathtaking, it left observers stunned. How could a kingdom that had survived for centuries disappear so completely in what felt like a historical blink of an eye? The answer reveals one of the most dramatic examples of political and military collapse in all of European history. The aftermath of Guadalete wasn't just a military defeat, it was the systematic erasure of an entire governmental system. Muslim forces didn't just conquer territory, they dismantled Visigothic political institutions piece by piece, replacing centuries of Germanic rule with Islamic administration. Within months, the peninsula that had been Gothic for nearly 300 years was operating under completely different laws, customs, and leadership structures. For surviving Gothic populations, the choices were stark and unforgiving: to convert to Islam and potentially thrive in the new order, accept hemistatus as Christian subjects, living under Islamic rule but maintaining their faith, or flee to the northern mountains where desperate Christian resistance movements were beginning to form what would eventually become new kingdoms. There was no fourth option, no going back to the way things were. With the fall of Spain, the last major Gothic kingdom ceased to exist. After nearly 4 centuries of achievement, influence, and adaptation, the political independence of the Gothic peoples had come to an absolute end. The great experiment of barbarian kingdoms ruling over Roman territories was finally over. But here's where this story takes an unexpected turn. The Goths may have lost the political war, but they won something far more valuable: cultural immortality. Their influence on European civilization would prove far more lasting and profound than their military conquests ever were. Consider the legal revolution they sparked. The legal codes developed by both Visigothic and Ostrogothic rulers didn't disappear with their kingdom minds, they became the foundation for medieval European jurisprudence. The Breviaria Valeric and the Libera Deciorum proved that it was possible to create unified legal systems governing diverse populations while respecting both Germanic and Roman traditions. These weren't just Gothic laws, they were blueprints for how medieval Europe would organize justice for centuries to come. The architectural legacy they left behind was equally transformative. Gothic builders had created something entirely new by combining Roman engineering excellence with Germanic decorative traditions. The churches, palaces, and fortifications they constructed established architectural precedents that would influence European building practices throughout the entire medieval period. Their emphasis on monumental stone construction and sophisticated defensive architecture directly contributed to the development of castle building techniques that would dominate European warfare for centuries. Perhaps most importantly, they saved classical learning from complete destruction. Scholars like Cassiodorus and Isidore of Seville, working under Gothic patronage, preserved ancient knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever during the chaos of the early medieval period. The libraries and schools established under Gothic rule provided models for medieval educational institutions that would transmit European intellectual traditions across generations. The Gothic concept of kingship proved revolutionary in ways that extended far beyond their own territories. They had created something unprecedented: a synthesis of traditional Germanic assembly democracy with Roman administrative efficiency. This produced new forms of royal authority that balanced monarchical power with aristocratic participation. establishing governmental models that would influence European politics for centuries. Even more significantly, they established the crucial principle that kings ruled under law rather than above it. This legal concept would eventually contribute to the development of constitutional monarchy ideas that would reshape European political development in fundamental ways. The Goths had essentially created the intellectual foundation for limited government centuries before anyone called it by that name. Their religious contributions, though eventually suppressed by Catholic orthodoxy, had lasting impact on European Christianity. The Gothic translation of the Bible into vernacular language provided models for later efforts to make Christian texts accessible to non-Latin speaking populations. They demonstrated that Christianity didn't have to be exclusively a Latin, Roman phenomenon. It could adapt to different cultures while maintaining its essential character. The military innovations developed by Gothic armies became standard practice throughout medieval Europe. Their integration of infantry and cavalry tactics, combined with sophisticated siege warfare techniques, provided organizational models that would be adopted by Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, and other European kingdoms. The Gothic emphasis on personal loyalty and warrior culture directly contributed to the development of feudal military systems that would dominate European warfare for centuries. As the final Gothic strongholds fell to Muslim conquest in Spain, and the last Ostrogothic resistance was crushed in Italy, something remarkable became clear. The Gothic peoples had achieved a form of immortality that no military victory could have provided. Their legal codes lived on in European courts. Their architectural innovations shaped medieval building. Their educational institutions preserved classical knowledge. Their governmental practices influenced royal authority across the continent. The Gothic experience had demonstrated both the incredible possibilities and the ultimate limitations of barbarian adaptation to Roman civilization. They had created cultural syntheses that would influence European development long after their kingdoms had vanished from political maps. In losing everything, they had somehow won eternal influence. The twilight of the Gothic kingdoms marked more than just the end of particular Germanic peoples. It represented the conclusion of the great age of barbarian kingdoms that had transformed the Roman world into the foundation of medieval Europe. The Goths had been part of one of history's most dramatic transformations, the metamorphosis of classical antiquity into medieval civilization. Their story proves a profound historical truth. Political power is temporary, but cultural influence can be eternal. The Goths conquered with swords, but they achieved immortality through ideas, institutions, and innovations that would outlast every kingdom they ever built. In the end, that may be the greatest victory of all.